This is the Democratizing the Bargaining Process, Open and Bargaining and Beyond. It's a teach-in organized by the Open Bargaining Working Group of the Cross Campus Strike Readiness Committee, co-sponsored by the PSC Committee for Adjuncts and Full-Timers and the Graduate Center chapter. That should be adjuncts and part-timers. This session is recorded, so we want to be able to share this with other people. So just wanted to put that out there for you. If you didn't see it in the chat, you can see my name. I'm Rebecca Smart. I'm an adjunct. I've been an adjunct at BMCC for over 10 years now, and an adjunct at Baruch for 5 years. I'm a delegate for the BMCC chapter. I'm the adjunct liaison at Baruch. So I've been really involved, but my relevance here is that I was also at Fordham where we had open bargaining. I might make some comments, but Billy Bragg, also great, yes. So anyways, welcome. And now I will turn it over to my co-moderator, Nic Nicoludis.
That's right. I know you get nervous when you say it, but you say it right every time. I'm Nic. I am also an adjunct at the Borough Community College, where I've been for about 5.5 years now, and also at City College for the last, I guess, 2 years. And I just want to give a little, I guess, more in-depth introduction before we introduce our two guests. So, across the US, we are seeing university administrations using the pandemic to cut programs, lay off workers while overworking others and making them less secure. We have yet to see the federal funds being used to reverse the layoffs or create more secure jobs, especially at CUNY, which is currently sitting on millions of dollars. Meanwhile, worker safety and dignified working conditions are deprioritized in the scramble to keep up enrollments. And we are fortunate to have a union facing these threats. But how do we make our unions more powerful and effective in fighting back? The power of the union, of course, is its membership. An organized and empowered membership means that there are consequences for the management if they refuse our demands. And top-down directives of information from union leadership tend to fall short in empowering the rank and file members, even when they're also gathering information from individual members. And we should be discussing, disputing, and making collective decisions in all aspects of our union work, expanding union democracy beyond just the elections for union offices and officers. Union democracy breaks down the service model of the union, where members pay dues to be serviced by staffers and elected leaders. And with contract negotiations just around the corner, I believe like January 2023, we turn, for us at PSC, we turn today to the question of union democracy and specifically bargaining. The usual model is that bargaining happens on our behalf behind closed doors, and members may attend to provide specific testimony, and some unions conduct member surveys to gauge member attitudes towards different issues and points in contracts. And this is the model we have at the PSC right now. And increasingly, however, unions, including ones like our own in higher education, have been embracing forms of open bargaining, where rank and file members attend and participate in contract bargaining. It is premised on the assumption that the power of the union is not in some esoteric kind of expertise behind closed doors by elected leaders and things, but in the actual membership of the union. And we know that open bargaining is not an easy process. It may present some challenges, but as a model for increased transparency and union democracy, we need to begin to have these conversations now. As we're looking toward the contract in another 1.5 years. And today we are so excited to have our two guests with us who have a lot of firsthand experience with democratizing bargaining processes and who will share their experiences with us. So I'll hand it over to Rebecca to introduce our guests for today.
Okay, so we have two speakers and they're gonna speak for 10 to 12 minutes. Jason, if you see me going like this when you're speaking, that means you're at 10. You know, I'm not gonna cut you off or anything, but so we want to have questions after both speakers. So first I'll introduce Jason. Jason Rodriquez is a member of the core bargaining team at the Faculty Staff Union at UMass Boston. He's been a union activist with FSU for the last 5 years, has served on the executive committee of his union and as a union liaison to the sociology department. And then Kelly is the executive vice president of the United Academics of Oregon State University and the lead negotiator for that union's open bargaining. Thank you for being able to participate in both of our sessions. We're actually having 2 sessions today, so she's putting in double duty for that. First, Jason, if you'd like to give us your 10 to 12 minutes on open bargaining. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Rebecca, Nick, and Sofya for that. Happy to be here. So yeah, I'm going to just try and keep it to 10 minutes. And I will only say a little bit on the sort of why do expanded or open bargaining, and say a little bit more, spend a little bit more time on the sort of the how it works and how we got it implemented over the objections of the administration. The previous time that we had bargaining at UMass Boston, it was an old school closed model where the bargaining team sort of thought of it as like a game of poker, where they had to keep all their information very close to the vest. And that necessarily reduces the amount of information that the union can give to its members. It diminishes member involvement. It may make it harder to get a contract ratified. And the bargaining team just couldn't really hear very much from members about what we wanted and how we wanted to get there. So this time around, we actually have an entirely new bargaining team, almost entirely new, and we decided to involve members as a resource. And so we don't see it as a poker game. Instead, we're leveraging the power of our membership. And this is, I think, a great way to involve members in the union. How we got it implemented. Well, the first thing that we did, and I do think this is important, is that we voted at our own FSU general membership meeting to establish expanded bargaining as our policy. This way, when we went into bargaining or began bargaining, we could say to the administration, look, this is our policy, so this is the only way we can do this. For legal reasons, we had to call it expanded bargaining and not open bargaining, because I'm not entirely sure of it all, but basically we have a core bargaining team, which is sort of what we conventionally think of as a bargaining team, and then an expanded team of up to 30 FSU members. So I think we couldn't call it open bargaining because that would make it, I don't know, it sounded like it was open to the world or something like that. And so our lawyer had told us call it expanded bargaining. So that's what I'm gonna call it. So we got expanded bargaining implemented as the policy for FSU. And then going into negotiations, we told the administration, this is our policy. We plan to bring a reasonable number of people to expanded bargaining. They didn't like that idea, said that they weren't open to that idea. And they sent us a Zoom link basically saying, okay, here it is, we'll see you then. And what we did was we set up a Zoom caucus link where we invited our members to join us to the caucus. And then in the caucus link before our first bargaining session, we gave the individuals who showed up at the caucus the link to the Zoom for bargaining, so that when the time came for bargaining to start, all of a sudden, rather than just the 9-member bargaining team, there was that plus 30 FSU members in the waiting room. And the administration had to kind of go through, figure out who was who, and then that began a conversation, a negotiation really over what the parameters of open bargaining or expanded bargaining would be. We went through about 2 to 3 negotiation sessions with the administration over the parameters of what expanded bargaining would look like. At first they said no, then they said up to 10 members of the expanded team, but they wanted it to be the same 10 each time. And we found that to be really problematic. It really doesn't open bargaining up all that much. And I think the turning point for how we won the final agreement was we asked our members to write to the administration, write to the administration's bargaining team, write to the provost, write to their lead lawyers, and say, essentially, you know, what are you afraid of? Why are you afraid to negotiate in front of your members? We want to be a part of this. And we made every good faith argument about the value of expanded bargaining. And of course, they don't care about that. The reason why they oppose it is because expanded bargaining is a key source of union power. But ultimately, they agreed to an expanded team of up to 30 members only during remote operations. So for all last year. And that was something that we weren't thrilled about, but we signed an MOU stating that that was going to be that we were okay with that. And I must say we were like a little bit astonished, I think, that like we actually won it, but we did. I'm sure there's some things I'm leaving out, and I want to, I'm happy to answer questions. Let me say a little bit about just the mechanics of how it actually works with the time I have left. So our members, we use a Zoom webinar format, and our members sign up for basically a webinar. And that means in the Zoom screen, you could see the names of the expanded team on the side, but you can't see their faces, and they're not participants in the actual negotiating session. They're silent observers. But then when we go into the caucus, it's every once in a while go, okay, we're going to caucus. Then the expanded team goes into the caucus with us, and that's when they can talk, and we all kind of talk together about what just occurred in bargaining. So we kind of bounce back and forth between 2 Zoom rooms. The last thing I just want to mention is like, what are we working towards now? So we've been in these negotiations for well over a year. We're certainly hoping to wrap it up soon. One thing that we are working on is trying to develop or implement really what we're calling a contract action team, which is a group of rank and file members who are committed activists who can help bring out people to our sessions and basically be there to do some of the activist organizing work to kind of help us maintain 30 members at our session. So that's kind of the key thing that we're working on. Let's see. Oh, I'm just taking a look at the chat here. Thank you, Sofya. Yeah, we have about 1,000 members, so it's 30 out of 1,000. Faculty staff union. We represent the faculty and the librarians in our union. And I'm just going to stop there, and happy to discuss questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was 7 minutes. Excellent.
7 minutes. Do you want me to keep? I do have more here. Should I go?
Yeah, you got some more comments if you want to throw them out. That's great.
Let's save time for discussion.
Save for questions. Perfect. Okay. So Kelly, you're up.
Okay, great. A lot of parallels, but some pretty big differences, I'd say, for us. So thanks again for having me. I'm an outreach librarian and associate professor at OSU. Our union is very, very new. We were certified by the state in 2018 and ratified our first contract in June 2020. We got a lot of help from union comrades around the country, so it's really feels good to be able to share back. So I was on the bargaining team for our inaugural contract negotiations and have been a part of all the bargaining we've done, which includes 2 rounds of impact bargaining related to COVID-19 and a salary reopener we just wrapped up. And I've been the lead negotiator for these most recent negotiations. So while our overall experience with bargaining is fairly limited, I do think one of the real benefits of being a new union is the opportunity to be intentional about how we build our culture. Open bargaining is absolutely a part of that. It's funny because getting contacted by Sofya, like, open bargaining is just bargaining. That's how we bargain. So, which I recognize is a privilege in many circumstances. But one of the planks of our original bargaining platform was transparency. And I honestly think this is one of our core values and goals as a union, that we push the administration for additional clarity and honesty, and that we seek to uphold that ourselves as an organization. So the university works better, our union works better with more eyes on our processes. I'm grateful to everyone who's been on our bargaining teams, but I particularly want to shout out the 3 union staff who helped us through that initial contract negotiation. Dave Cecil, Ashley Bromley, and Dan. They were able to share their experiences that really helped us make thoughtful choices that have served us well through that negotiation and on. So to go chronologically, we started bargaining our first contract in November 2018. And Jason, it sounded familiar, the sort of back and forth about what it'll look like. I have a lot I could say about ground rules, but what I will say is that the openness of bargaining is really the most controversial element in getting those ground rules set. I went back and looked. It took us, I think, at least 4 sessions, which were mostly 3 or 4 hours long, in order to totally settle our ground rules. And I will link to those in the chat here. So the admin objections hinged in part on attendee behavior. There had been a faculty member down at the University of Oregon who infamously sort of live blogged bargaining. So there were concerns about how faculty might be disruptive. We had the amazing moment of the admin lead negotiator claiming that she felt intimidated by faculty in attendance. As you can imagine, the faculty in attendance were deeply offended by this. I know at least one member kept bringing it up months and months later, that the only thugs in the room were on the admin side of the table. But really, seeking closed bargaining is about control, right? Admin tried to insist that negotiations would magically go better, that we could somehow build more trust if it was all done behind closed doors. This is premised on the sort of secretive wheeling and dealing that Jason alluded to. A real contrast from our values. Honestly, I'm skeptical that closed bargaining is ever more effective for unions, either in terms of big wins and certainly of building power. As a bargaining team, we also had other commitments to transparency in our practices. So we don't usually allow sidebars between negotiators. We try and get out bargaining updates to the entire bargaining unit as quickly as we can after each session. And we post all our proposals, not just our proposals, all proposals that get passed, we post on our website. We also have made sure we held bargaining sessions at other campuses. OSU has faculty spread really throughout the state. So that was important to show that we're not just representing faculty here in Corvallis. And all of this transparency also has strategic value. Well-informed members are more likely to see the effort that's gone into the contract that you bring back to ratify. So we don't want members to be surprised by where we end up. When we moved to Zoom bargaining, we ended up having to rework the ground rules, and they ultimately did become more narrow, unfortunately. I think at the time there was a lot of fear of Zoom bombing, which in retrospect, we probably could have found other workarounds for. We've all spent a lot more time on Zoom since then, but we did agree to limit attendance just to members of our bargaining unit, when before really anyone could show up. A union staffer and an admin staffer check names as people come in to the waiting room. I honestly think admin was spooked by their negotiations at the time with our grad employee union, which typically uses pretty boisterous tactics. So I think they just were kind of scared from that. We did have one time in our Zoom bargaining last summer over COVID stuff that a state senator showed up, and we did ultimately let her in. Admin made a show of being annoyed, but I think they also recognized that not letting her in would have looked even worse for them. And our Zoom ground rules, I don't have. Yeah, Nick showed up to this was specifically about COVID and campus reopening. So it's impact bargaining, not opening up the whole contract. And I'm gonna upload, I could not find where we have the Zoom ground rules on our website. So I'm just gonna upload them in the chat here. So even though our negotiations as we've been doing them by Zoom have been open only to bargaining unit members, they are the most important people, right? The people who absolutely need access. We'll see when we get back to in-person bargaining what that will look like. So as I've mentioned, open bargaining gives members a chance to see what's going on. Admin will invariably say ridiculous and harmful things at the table. Many of us have never had to hear administrators talk about what they really think of us, and seeing it at the table can be revelatory. One moment like this that seared in my brain from our inaugural contract negotiations came up as we were discussing the lack of childcare in Corvallis. Faculty often try and get their names on the wait list for the campus childcare center, like right when they get pregnant, in the hopes that by the time their kid is ready for childcare, their name might have come to the top of the list. And OSU does offer some kind of meager childcare subsidy for people who are on the waiting list. It's something pretty, I can't remember the number exactly, but it's a drop in the bucket, right? But in one session, an administrator was asking this series of questions that made us realize that she was suggesting that faculty might be lying about their need for childcare in order to get that subsidy. And it just was on its face, completely ludicrous and offensive. And I'm so glad that there were other people in the room for that, right? More recently, in our salary reopener, one of our bargaining team members asked administrators to define equity, since they kept insisting it was far too complex to be dealt with in negotiations with our union. The admin team just could not come up with a definition. It was amazing to watch, just like in a classroom, someone who's not done the reading. Again, I was so glad that there were other faculty in the room for that. Open bargaining can also be strategic in a campaign. As we work through particularly contentious issues, it can help to have a room full of supporters behind you. Of course, it only works if you can get people into the room. So open bargaining may as well be closed if no one shows up. So I have to thank our membership and organizing committee for turning people out at crucial moments throughout all of our bargaining. And organizing or open bargaining can also be an organizing tool. So I know of several cases where faculty join the union after attending bargaining. As we say, administration is the best organizer, and that certainly plays out at the table. In one case, a colleague of mine attended many sessions before joining the union. And ultimately, he told me that he joined because he realized how intractable the admin team was. And he just watched the amount of work we were putting in to getting the best deal that we could for faculty. So for bargaining unit members who say things like, why do you have to be so antagonistic? Why don't you ask nicely? It can help to see what those conversations are actually like. We typically also have the B team stick around for a few minutes after a session so that members can ask questions and share comments as well. So it's not just a one-way thing. We always have time to debrief. For union leaders who might be concerned about having more attention on their own processes, I would just say, if you're worried about it, you probably especially need it, right? It's our role as the bargaining team to get meaningful input from members about what they want before we head to the table. Take that to the table, and stay in communication with members. There really should be no surprises about what we ask for and ultimately where we settle. I think, I'd be happy to talk more about strategy in that, because I think it's true there are things the bargaining team is doing thinking that maybe doesn't get shared before a session, for example, but there shouldn't be surprises in terms of the big stuff. Having a strong and unified bargaining team is all a big part of this. By the time we get those proposals and arguments to the table. A lot of people have looked at it, and any mistakes are shared between the team. And if we're making mistakes, we need to hear that from members, right? So to sum up, open bargaining builds transparency of the outlandish things that administrators will say, but also for accountability of the bargaining team to the union members that it serves.
Perfect. That was so good. Okay, and you came in at 11 minutes, but it evens out because Jason was under 10. So does anyone have any questions or comments regarding the our speakers, our illustrious speakers? Yes, Jerry.
First, thank you so much for coming in and hosting this discussion with us today. You know, I'm curious about strategies in approaching our own leadership, because one of the things that you talked a lot about is the difficulty with admin buying into open bargaining. But first, we need to have our own union buy into this concept. And, you know, I hope that the case that we have a relatively new leadership means that this is an opportunity, but I have not heard anything in that respect. And certainly the last leadership was not in favor of open bargaining. The best we have, and I've even heard this as an excuse from people, is like, well, sometimes we let people come and sit in the back quietly and watch. They come for like an hour or two and then they never come again. I was one of those people who sat in the back and watched at one point. So how do we, you know, take this idea, which to me seems like self-evidently a good one for transparency and democracy, and especially I think about, Kelly, what you said about how most people don't really think about how horrible the administration is until they hear about it, but, you know, actually hear the terrible things that they say. But anyway, I'm just trying to think of if you have any advice on the direction we should go in with our own leadership to push for this going forward.
Kelly, you want to?
Sure, I'll just say briefly, because again, I think we're the unusual situation where, you know, our leadership has been down for open bargaining from the start. So, but what I would say is thinking about the benefits back to the union rather than, I think, so the organizing piece I think is huge. And there will be people who will still come up to me and be like, I can't believe that they said that to our faces. And just seeing that process, right? So it's, I think all of that is really good. It's like a kind of event that's a great way to say, ask faculty to bring in to, right? It's a pretty low entry union activity. You don't have to do anything necessarily. It's a chance to come and learn from the process, connect with people, that kind of thing. So I think if you can get your organizing, chair of organizing or whoever the leadership focused on that element bought in, that might be an entry point. Because I think that it's like anything, right? Where if you're used to doing it in private and then suddenly you're being asked to expose that, there's fear around what the consequences could be individually, but this is about a collective benefit. So focusing on those collective benefits, right?
Yeah. We had to do a lot of internal organizing, Jerry, on just to get more of our members, first off, to do that education of what is expanded or open bargaining and what are the drawbacks of the kind of closed bargaining. And the previous bargaining team had a lot of the same members for multiple years. They thought they were going to be the group doing bargaining the way it had always been done. And there was kind of an internal push among rank and file members to implement or to get approved at a general membership meeting this policy that the FSU would only engage in expanded bargaining. And then when we passed that, it passed over the objections of the president of our union and the vice president or the immediate predecessor vice president of the union, and many members of the old bargaining team were against it. So once we got the policy done, we still had the issue of our FSU president at the time saying, well, to me, FSU open bargaining means you just let the members know where bargaining is going to happen. And that's not what the policy said, and it's not how we understood expanded bargaining. And so ultimately, the insurgents took over and now walk the halls of Congress, because we have a new FSU president and a new FSU vice president and a new bargaining team who are all big supporters of expanded bargaining. And I just want to add one thing to what Kelly said, which was like, when you were saying that faculty members could be shocked at how the administration talks about what, talks about their employees, talks about us as faculty, like that was something that really hit home, because once we had our high person in our administration was calling a lot of our non-tenure track faculty accidents, that they're there to cover accidents like sabbaticals or something like that. And like when our members could actually see the administration talking like this, it was just a shock. And so it's a great tool for organizing, but basically to get it implemented, we had to do a lot of internal organizing first.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I think on some level we need to do, because our issue at the PSC is that we're not just trying to work against administration to have open bargaining, but also our own leadership. And their common thing is, well, these are elected members. They were elected by the membership, so they're approved by the membership. So therefore, you should trust us. And a lot of people are like, no. So anyways, okay. So why don't we take a couple more? I have a question, but also I put myself on stack, but it's also more of a comment. So I'll wait. So why don't we take a couple of questions and then see if those can be answered more. That's a great question, Alicia. So we'll add that. But
I
Jay.
think Boyda was
Boyda.
first.
Yeah. Boyda, Nick, then was me, then Jay. So why don't you three go? And then we'll also kind of talk. I'll just read this question in the chat. PSC is large. It consists of many forms of workers, titles, full-time faculty, adjuncts, faculty library, higher education officers, lab techs, and more. Our closed bargainer reps often seem like they may forget the ways decisions impact across PSC. Have you seen open bargaining help in clarifying details and impacts across titles? Love that. I'm all about cross-title bargaining. Needs to be important because other groups get left behind. So that's one thing to consider. Okay, Boyda.
Okay, thanks. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll try to sort of pare it down. And this is really useful. And thank you so much to Jason and Kelly for sharing your experiences. I guess I love the idea of open bargaining being like a recruitment tool for people who can be sort of activated and mobilized by seeing how awful the administration can be. And then I think it kind of brings up the question of how do we help people trust the union, because the reality is a lot of people, especially in a huge union like PSC, where there's kind of been the same leadership structures in place for 20 years, that the reality is we are seeing fewer and fewer people joining the union. And so we do need to sort of rebuild trust and in some ways kind of press reset, I think, on a lot of the really ossified policies that have just become sort of standard and unquestioned. And if you do question them, you're sort of considered like a rabble rouser, troublemaker, or whatever. And I guess I just wondered, because Jason, you mentioned that you had a bunch of members writing to the admin, but also the older bargaining team, right? And asking like, what are you afraid of? And I think Kelly gave some answers to those questions that the admin was kind of like talking about the behavior of attendees of whatever, like Zoom bombers, and, some of these answers that I think are often just made in bad faith in terms of being bullied. Like that doesn't exist in that kind of reverse power dynamic. But I wondered if you actually were able to drag answers out of people, Jason, or if people were just kind of deflecting, or how they sort of responded to that.
The admin made they made a number of arguments. For example, they said, and it feels weird even to report them because I feel like a lot of them were made in bad faith. I mean, but they said, well, if members come and say they show up for one bargaining session, they won't have any context for the final agreement. So then there's an agreement, but if they've only attended for, say, 1 or 2 sessions, they won't really understand how the agreement was arrived at. Members of our old bargaining team, I think the hesitation for them, aside from that's just the way we've always done it, is, well, you don't want to let admin know too much about what we have planned. Like I said, it was like a poker game for them. But our response was, well, what's happening is you're not letting members know. So like I first got involved in my union because I was pretty pissed at how bargaining was going. I had no idea how it was going. And what I was hearing back was like bits and pieces of a lot of bad things. And, I think it actually like undermined our bargaining to not have members aware and involved of what was going on. So those were kind of the key, I would say, for both sides or those two parties. That's what their main arguments were.
Do you also want to address the cross title component as well in the other question that I read? Do you have any, either Kelly or Jason? Like, I don't know how many different types of titles you have. Kelly, you said you're a librarian.
Yeah, we have a lot of types of faculty. So faculty research assistants come to mind. So we have teaching faculty, total research faculty, sort of arranged, and also extension officer, offices around the state. So people doing pretty varied types of work, both by title, but also just by the nature of their work and their work site. So I think that Zoom has been great for that. It's going to be hard for us to decide whether face-to-face bargaining actually makes sense in the future. There's real benefits to it. But given how geographically spread our bargaining unit is, I think it in some ways has made it easier just for people to attend, obviously. I think that having a wide variety of titles on your bargaining team is also crucial. Maybe that's implied, but I think, being a librarian, I'm an associate professor is my classification, but there are things that are weird about me because I'm a 12-month employee, because so on. So having that variety on the bargaining team is important. I also just think that it's not just about having those open sessions, having our bargaining updates. I'm amazed at how many people actually read them, just in that sense of like, we get a lot of emails, but we get a lot of questions. So a lot of times the specific questions are, I'm a this, that, and the other. How does this apply to me? Will this raise apply to me? I'm, for whatever the situation is. So I think giving people the opportunity to ask those questions is often, we want to do as much as we can to be in conversation with the people who might have unusual circumstances. But also a part of that is just making it real clear. Here's how you can ask us if you have questions, or if you think we're messing this up for you, please let us know.
Yeah, and let me just add how it's been for the faculty staff union. So one of the challenges is we represent the faculty of, it's about, I think it's now closer to about 800 or 900, something like that. And it's almost 50-50 split between non-tenure track faculty who also have different ranks and tenure track faculty. But then we also represent librarians, and we have maybe 10 or 11 or 12 librarians. And so for the first time with the core bargaining team, we have a librarian on the team, and the librarian has developed she's developed proposals. It's actually like some of the few proposals that have gotten agreed to from the admin, because the librarians in our union were kind of neglected for a long time and lost out on wage enhancements and other types of benefits. So that has been good. But another component that I think has been helpful of having expanded bargaining between our NTT faculty and our TT faculty is, previously, although the NTT bargaining reps and the TT bargaining reps were on the same team, they kind of operated separately and developed their own proposals. Okay, we're going to develop this proposal for continuing appointments for non-tenure track faculty, and this proposal for a research intensive semester for tenure track faculty. And I think now we can see, and we talk a lot more about how a proposal that may be intended to help TT faculty may actually be undermining or making things worse for NTT faculty. And so we're I think doing better at trying to see how these, different forms of workers, how we are connected, and trying to build that into the bargaining process.
Okay, I just wanted to add as sort of my question. So I was one of those people invited to the bargaining at PSC, and it's like I just got to sit in the back row. But I also had the advantage of just having come from bargaining at Fordham, where we'd finally like gotten 7,000 a class, and that's what we were trying to get in the PSC bargaining at that time. And so they were talking about it, and the administration was like, that's too much. And I was like, we got it at Fordham. But I couldn't even say that out loud. Like I had to whisper it to someone, and then they whispered it, and then they whispered it. And then it came out of, our lead negotiator, our president, Barbara Bowen's mouth. But at Fordham, what I found the best about the open bargaining, because it was just, I'd never done any union work before that. And I learned a lot about just, not just terminology, but what you can and can't fight for, and how you fight for it, and how administration acts. And it was like this really great crash course, and it made me want to do more. So I think that whole idea of open bargaining as an organizing is perfect, because as a psychologist, I know that when workers feel autonomy in their own workspace, they're happier and work better. And that applies here the same. Okay, Nick and then Jay. I haven't seen anyone else come on Stack for questions. So if you have questions, type Stack, but go ahead, Nick.
I'm gonna pass to Jay.
Okay. Jay, are you still here?
Yeah, here. So my question is around the breadth of how we define open bargaining. The strategic power of workers in the public sector, particularly in education, which has been driven home by the pandemic, is that we are organically connected to the broader working class, right, as the provider of a vital public service. And it connects us with the demands, the pressing demands. And it isn't simply the PSC line, our working conditions are their learning conditions, but in fact, the living conditions, which has been driven home by the pandemic, are our working conditions. They come into the classroom. So my question is, it didn't seem that the definition of open bargaining included the working class recipients of our service, including students, but beyond that. But I was wondering if that came into the discussion and how that would be concretized about raising common demands, which I think would need, popular assemblies to do that. So if it was discussed, if it was brought in, how that would be operationalized. And I think, getting back to Jason's question about we want to keep, the bureaucrats' approaches keep our demands issues close to our vest. And in fact, this is a way, being open about that, of who we are including and the broad demands, to instill fear, one, in the state, because that's the only way we're going to get any concessions. And secondly, of preparing for a strike, because you're not really going to get anything clearly through sitting down with these criminals, particularly in this context, but building the broad class power that we're going to need for a successful strike needs to bring in the broader working class with those common demands that even some dissidents are comfortable with. So that's my question and comment.
Kelly, Jason?
Sure, I can speak so briefly in that I think that our original, when we were face to face, open bargaining meant open, like anyone could show up. We're pretty connected to our state AFT affiliate. So there are some natural partnerships, I think, that we got into. COVID showed up sort of before we hit the strategic points where we may have, made a point to bring in colleagues from other unions, right? Comrades from other unions. So definitely to everything you're saying, we didn't get there in what we've done. And I think that what we accepted in terms of bargaining by Zoom was totally limited to the bargaining unit. So in terms of attending bargaining, everything we post is public, but I think that's also kind of reflects us as a new union, just trying to build our membership internally has been a big focus. So hell yeah, but we're not there yet is what I'll say from OSU.
I feel the same, but I think, you're right, is that you do have to raise the social cost, right? I mean, you have to raise the social cost for them to get away with what they want to get away with, and I mean, we argued a lot over what's the number, what is reasonable in terms of the number of members who can be present. And for a long time, what we said was reasonable is all 800 members of the union. That's what's reasonable, especially in a Zoom format. That's reasonable. And so they did get frustrated with us because for a while they were like, okay, well, our first number was 0. Now our number is 10 and your number is 800. And we were like, yeah, that's our number, 800. And so I do think you got to do whatever you can to raise the social cost for the administration to do what it wants to do secretly.
This makes me think of, I have conversations with the custodial staff. I talk to the DC 37, which are the office workers, some of the office workers at CUNY. And, but as far as our leadership says they work with DC 37, but I've never been in a meeting with DC 37 people, right? And that's just very basic. We're all on the same campuses, right? And even among the DC 37 workers, there's differences. There's the custodians and the office workers are both DC 37, correct? Is that, I think that's true. But yeah, for us to really show our power, if there's still people there to let people in the building, that's it. So it all needs to be in there. Okay, yeah, Nick, I was just rambling.
Okay, so since we have a little time, I just want to ask, kind of a quick question. It's kind of something based off what you meant, something you kind of mentioned offhandedly almost, Kelly, which was about building a culture. And so I was interested in both of you, how you could maybe talk about, I think in Jason's case, moving towards opening bargaining, Kelly, in your case, kind of building that in a kind of newer union, about kind of building the culture and shaping a culture of a union towards those kind of open bargaining and collective bargaining practices, and how you kind of build that and cultivate that kind of culture again, in the building of a new union, and also in a transferring of a different kind of bargaining style in the case of Jason.
Well, I mean, I think the expanded bargaining is one piece of making a more democratic union, and we were very much a sort of a closed, just a closed union and have had to do a lot. I mean, expanded bargaining has been one piece of building union democracy, but there have been others too. I mean, we've just tried to do a lot more to involve our members, not just by letting them know what's going on, but by having forums where they can come and talk, and what topics should we do in a forum, and just trying to build all different ways to enhance member participation and the value of their being involved in the union. And, you know, expanded bargaining has been one really important piece of that, but it's not the only piece, because it's really been about a 5-year, I would say over the last 5 years or longer, there's been a slow but consistent change in the way our union has functioned away from more of a service-oriented administrative type union to one that is trying to do much more along the lines that we've been talking about here today.
Yeah, I was just trying to do the math, and this is actually the first school year we've had elected officials in our union the full year. So like we're literally building our democratic processes right now in terms of how does our rep assembly work with the executive council, like whose responsibility is what, and you know, so I think there's some of that stuff. It's easy to see how you know, it would be easy to concentrate that for simplicity's sake or efficiency or whatever. So to some extent, we're just like figuring out the nuts and bolts of it, which I think it's good to have a lot of the members of that original open bargaining team are part of leadership, elected leadership now. So I think there's some strong commitment to the processes that we've used in terms of, you know, we had a consensus-based model for a long time for our organizing committee before we even formed a union. So I think that there's some like culture that's built in terms of thinking about how to do things. Some of it is like, how do meetings get structured? Are they mostly elected people talking or other people talking, right? Like, I think stuff like that feels really basic maybe, but you know, that's how I look at the agenda for our general membership meeting and kind of calculate the minutes and think like, this doesn't seem right? This seems lopsided. Sometimes there's a reason for it. Can be times you need to push information out, but like as a whole, being able to, you know, we have strength because of members talking to each other and getting shit done, right? So we're trying to build culture. I mean, part of it is also most of the members of our union have never been in a union before, never had a union to be in. So some of it is just like total lack of context. So in that way, I think bargaining has been great because it's pulling back the veil on something that usually the provost likes to drop, you know, oh, I'm giving you all raises. And that's how that happens, right? And it's like, no, that's not how that happens anymore. And it's this long process that we all have a role in. So I think it's sort of a pick things as they come up to build and shape that culture. I don't think I said we're trying to build caucuses too, and like people don't know what that means. We're lucky in that we have quite a few, our grad employee union is longstanding and very, very strong. And we have people transition into our bargaining unit and they've been able to bring that. They have a really strong caucus culture at CGE. So being able to, they've been able to help us other faculty learn like what the point of a caucus is and sort of how to use that effectively. And I'm really grateful to that.
Sofya.
Yeah, thank you both. Quick question. So you both spoke so powerfully about the effect on members, you know, really hearing the way the administration talks about us. But how has it changed the dynamics of the administration to have the members in the bargaining sessions? Does it change what they say, how they act?
Yes, I think so. I mean, at least it has for us. It certainly got a lot more cordial. And I have definitely felt a difference. I mean, most of our sessions have been with expanded bargaining, but before that, I mean, we had when COVID was just going down and we were talking about health and safety, and a member of their team said, well, we're not going to follow you around with a bottle of bleach. And that was before we had open bargaining. And then I just knew there's no way this person would have said something like that when there are 30 faculty members observing. You know, I mean, so we got, it definitely changed. Yeah, Kelly.
And the only contract, because we've had, like I said, we've had members, you know, I think the first couple sessions we had way back in 2018, as we were figuring out ground rules, we didn't, at some point we just started inviting people, and then we, you know, that made it a lot easier to get those ground rules settled. But I think the contrast in, you know, our president and grievance chair and ED meet regularly with the, you know, lead negotiator of that team for labor management meetings. And I think the tenor of those meetings are different, but the purpose of those meetings is different as well. So I think there can be more frankness in those LMMs because they're dealing with confidential material. They're talking about individual faculty members. So it makes sense that those are different kinds of conversations.
Okay, I will just tell my one funny story from open bargaining. We were asking that adjuncts be allowed to keep books from the library over the summer so that they could use them for research or if they were teaching a class. And the administration was pushing back against that. And they said, you know, what if they, you know, basically they said, what if they steal it? And we were all like immediately indignant. And, you know, and we had, the way we set it up was like, if you can show up, then you go to bargaining. And we would have on average between 5 and 20 people in the room. And so that day there was a lot of people in the room and everyone got super pissed. So they dialed it back. But then in private, their lead negotiator talked to our lead negotiator and said, actually, adjuncts have taken over $30,000 worth of books and not returned them to the Fordham Library. But they still agreed to let us keep them over the summer. And because then we were like, well, maybe if you had paid them better, they wouldn't steal your books. So anyways, all right. Are there any other comments? Questions? Right, exactly. Yeah. Call us thieves, but also pay us so little that we have to resort to thievery. What? Yes. So anyone else? We're at like slightly over an hour. We'd planned for an hour and I think it went great. Yeah. Any last minute? Anything? Thank you so much for our speakers for taking time. Very much. And I don't know how to end this, guys. So someone else sum it up and say goodbye. I'm terrible.
Come again at
goodbyes.
6 because we have slightly different speakers and different audience and different questions, and we'll share the recordings of both with all of you. How about that?
Yes, there will be another session at 6 if you're too shy now and then you want to think about it and come up with some brilliant questions for this evening. And go to your chapter meetings if you're a CUNY, right? Like this is how you start getting your voice, saying like, you know what, I want to be on the bargaining team. I'm a CLT. Nobody ever talks about our issues. So, okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
day.
Great. So welcome to the Democratizing the Bargaining Process, Open Bargaining and Beyond teach-in, which is organized by the Open Bargaining Working Group of the Cross Campus Strike Readiness Committee and is co-sponsored by the PSC Committee for Adjuncts and Part-Timers, as well as the Graduate Center chapter. We're recording the session so we can share it with members who are not able to attend, or if any of you want to watch closely another time. My name is Sofya Aptekar. I teach at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, and I'm in the Graduate Center chapter. This is our second session of the day, and we have two awesome guests from Oregon State and UMass Boston. And before I turn it over to them to talk about how democratizing the bargaining process works in their unions, I'm just going to give a little intro about today's teach-in. So across the US, we're seeing at university administrations using the pandemic to cut programs, lay off some workers, while overworking the remaining workers and making them less secure. And we have yet to see the federal funds being used to reverse the layoffs, including on our campuses, or create more secure jobs. Well, at the same time, worker safety, dignified working conditions are deprioritized in the scramble to keep up enrollments above all else. We are fortunate to have a union and facing these threats, but how do we make our unions more powerful and more effective in fighting these things? The power of the union is its membership. Unorganized, empowered membership means that there are consequences for the management if they refuse our demands. Top-down directives or information from the union leadership tends to fall short in empowering the rank and file members, even when union leadership is gathering information from individuals. We should be discussing, disputing, making collective decisions in all aspects of our union work, expanding union democracy beyond just elections for union office. And union democracy breaks down the service model of the union, where basically members pay dues to be serviced by staffers and elected leaders. Our contract negotiations in the PSC are coming sooner than we want to even start thinking about it. And we turn today to the question of union democracy, specifically in bargaining. The usual model is that bargaining happens on our behalf as members behind closed doors. Sometimes members do attend, either to watch silently in the back or to provide specific testimony. And some unions conduct member surveys to kind of gauge member attitudes towards different issues in the contract. So this is the model we have in our union, the PSC. Increasingly, however, unions, including unions like ours in higher ed, have been embracing forms of open bargaining, where rank and file members attend and participate in contract bargaining. And this is premised on the assumption that the power of the union is not esoteric expertise behind closed doors, but again, in the membership. We know that open bargaining is not an easy process, both in transitioning to it if there was something else before, but also in making it work and being truly democratic. And it can present some challenges, but as a model for increased transparency and union democracy, we need to begin to have these conversations in our union. So today we're excited to host guests from higher education unions at Oregon State University and University of Massachusetts, Boston, who have had firsthand experience with democratizing the bargaining process and who will share these experiences with us. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests, and I'm going to ask them to speak for about 10-12 minutes about how it all works and how they got open or expanded bargaining in their unions. So Kelly McElroy is the Executive Vice President of the United Academics of Oregon State University, and she's the lead negotiator for that union's open bargaining. And we give a special thank you to Kelly because she has participated in both of our sessions today. That is real worker solidarity right there. And Steve Striffler, who is the president of the Faculty and Staff Union at UMass Boston, who has served on the executive committee of the union and is a director of the Labor Resource Center at that university. So we ask you each to share with us why your union had to push for open bargaining and its advantages, how it got implemented over the objections of management, as we know there were, how it actually works, like what does it actually look like, feel like, and any issues and goals that your union is working towards to strengthen union democracy when it comes to the bargaining process. And then once we hear from you, we'll open it up for a Q&A and the conversations among us about how or whether we should have open bargaining at the PSC. Kelly, would you like to go first?
Sure. And I have to apologize to everyone who is here for a second dose of my same spiel I'm going to share. So apologies in advance, but if you want to mute yourself for 10 minutes and come back, that I will not be offended. I'm an outreach librarian at Oregon State University and an associate professor, as well as Sofya said, the executive vice president of our faculty union, which is affiliated with AFT and AAUP. Our union's still very new, so we were certified by the state in 2018. And we ratified our first contract in June 2020. So we got so much help from union comrades across the country as we were building our union, and we still get help. There's so many things you have to figure out as the new union. So I'm really happy to be here to share our experiences as you all are thinking about using open bargaining. I was on the bargaining team for our inaugural contract negotiations and have been a part of all of the bargaining that we've done since then, which includes 2 rounds of impact bargaining related to COVID-19 and a salary reopener, which we just wrapped up. And I, as Sofya said, have been the lead negotiator just for those most recent negotiations. So while our overall experience with bargaining is pretty limited, I do think one of the true benefits of being a new union is the opportunity to be intentional about how we build our culture. So open bargaining is definitely a part of that. It's actually just bargaining to us, right? That's how we've always bargained. One of the planks of our original bargaining platform was transparency. And I really think this is one of our core values and goals as a union, that we push the administration for additional clarity and honesty, and that we seek to uphold that ourselves as an organization. So we think the university works better and our union works better with more eyes on the processes. I'm grateful to everyone who's been on our bargaining teams, but I want to shout out the 3 union staff who helped us through that initial contract bargaining: Dave Cecil, Ashley Bromley, and Dan Anderson. They were able to share experiences to help us make really thoughtful choices that have served us well over the long term. So to go back to the start, we started bargaining our first contract in November 2018. Ground rules are something I have strong feelings about, but rather than dwell on that, I will plop in the chat here the link to our ground rules we established for those negotiations. Definitely the most controversial part of that was getting the openness of our bargaining. I went back and looked, and it took us at least 4 sessions, which were mostly 3 or 4 hours long, to settle our ground rules, which I've added into the chat. So the admin objections hinged in part on attendee behavior. There had been a faculty member down at the University of Oregon who infamously live blogged about bargaining there. So there were concerns about sort of how faculty may be disruptive. We had this amazing moment where the lead negotiator of the admin team claimed that she felt intimidated by faculty in attendance. As you can imagine, the faculty who were in attendance were very offended by this. There was at least one member who kept bringing it up months and months later, that the only thugs in the room had been on the admin side of the table. But really, seeking closed bargaining was about control. Admin tried to insist that negotiations would somehow magically go better, that we could build more trust if it were all done behind closed doors. This assumes that secretive wheeling and dealing is more effective, which is a contrast from our values. And I have to say, I'm skeptical that closed bargaining is ever more effective for unions, either in terms of big wins or of building power over time. As a bargaining team, we also have other commitments to transparency in our practices. For example, we don't typically allow sidebars between the lead negotiators. We seek to get our bargaining updates out to the entire bargaining unit as quickly as possible after each session. We post all proposals that get passed on our website. We also made sure we held bargaining sessions at our other campuses. OSU has faculty spread really throughout the state. So it was a way to show the bargaining team was all faculty from Corvallis, the main campus, but we weren't just thinking about Corvallis, right? And all of this transparency has strategic value as well. Well-informed members are more likely to see the effort that's gone into the contract that you bring back to ratify. We don't want members to be surprised about where we end up. When we moved to Zoom bargaining, we ended up having to rework the ground rules, and they ultimately did become more narrow. And I couldn't actually find where I'm sure it's on our website somewhere. This is an embarrassing thing as a librarian always to admit, but I'll just upload the sort of add-on to our ground rules that we added when we went by Zoom. So I think at the time there was a lot of fear of Zoom bombing, which in retrospect, we probably could have found workarounds. We've all spent more time on Zooms in the meantime. It was early days of COVID then, but we did end up agreeing to limit attendance just to members of our bargaining unit when previously anyone who showed up could attend. A union staffer and an admin staffer check names as people come into the waiting room. I think that our admin was spooked by, they were in negotiations at the time with our grad employee union, which typically uses pretty boisterous tactics. So I think they were trying to limit just to faculty. There's lots of reasons why, but I'm sure that was a factor. We did have one time in our Zoom bargaining last summer. So this was COVID impact bargaining where our state senator showed up, and we did ultimately let her in. The admin team was clearly annoyed, but I think they also recognized that not letting her in would have looked even worse for them. So even though these Zoom negotiations have only been open to bargaining unit members, that at the bottom line, those are the most important people who need access, right? We can't have less than that. As I've mentioned, open bargaining gives members a chance to see what's going on. I want to give a couple sort of juicy examples of how that plays out. So admin will invariably say just like ridiculous and hurtful things at the table. Many of us have never had to hear administrators talk about what they really think of us. And seeing that at the table can really be revelatory. One moment that seared in my brain from our inaugural contract negotiations came when we were discussing the lack of childcare in Corvallis, where our main campus is. Faculty often try to get their names on the wait list for the campus childcare center as they get pregnant in the hopes that their name will be up on the list by the time their kid needs it. OSU does offer a meager childcare subsidy for folks who are on the waiting list. I forget the exact number, but it's very insubstantial. In one session, an admin member of their team asked a series of questions that helped us realize that she was suggesting that faculty might be lying about their need for childcare in order to get that subsidy. Just like a totally outlandish and offensive claim. And I was so glad that there were other people in the room for that. More recently in our salary reopener, one of our team members asked administrators to define equity since they kept insisting it was too complex to be dealt with in negotiations with our union. And they just like couldn't come up with a definition. It was amazing to watch. But also again, a time where I was glad there were other faculty in the room to hear that. Open bargaining can also be strategic in a bargaining campaign. As we work through particularly contentious issues, it helped us to have a room full of supporters behind us, whether that's in person, people wearing t-shirts, or a sea of union emblems in a Zoom room. Of course, it only works if you can get people into the room, so open bargaining may as well be closed if no one shows up. So I have to thank our membership and organizing committee for turning people out at crucial moments in our bargaining. Open bargaining can also be an organizing tool. I know of several cases where faculty join the union after attending bargaining. As we always say, administration is the best organizer, and that certainly plays out at the table. In one case, a colleague of mine attended many sessions before joining the union and ultimately told me that the reason he joined was that he had seen how intractable the admin team was, and also just was in awe of the amount of work our bargaining team was doing to get the best deal that we could for faculty. For bargaining unit members who say things like, why do you have to be so antagonistic? Why can't you just ask nicely? It really helps to see what those conversations are actually like. We also typically have the B team stick around for a few minutes after a session so that members can ask questions and share their comments as well. For union leaders who might be concerned about having more attention to their own processes, I would just say, if you're worried about it, you probably especially need it, right? It's our role as the bargaining team to get meaningful input from members about what they want before we go to the table, then to take that to the table, and then to receive feedback sort of throughout the process. There really should be no surprises about what we ask for and ultimately where we settle. For me, having a strong and unified bargaining team is a big relief for the sort of fear around that. By the time we get proposals and arguments to the table, a lot of smart strategic people have looked at that. Any mistakes we make at the table are shared mistakes of the bargaining team. And if we're making mistakes, we need to hear about it from our members, right? So just to sum up, open bargaining builds transparency of the outlandish and offensive things that administrators will say, but also for accountability of the bargaining team to the union members that we serve.
Sofya, am I supposed to jump in?
Yeah, I can introduce Steve, but I
don't have to know. I wasn't sure.
Steve was going to. I'll jump in. I'm supposed to be helping Sofya moderate this panel. So I'm Boyda Johnstone, she, her. I'm assistant professor at Borough Manhattan Community College. I'm also a delegate for our a new full delegate for the chapter, our chapter in the union. Thank you so much for that really excellent and eloquent and just sort of human overview of the issues, Kelly, at where you are at Oregon State University. And so I really look forward to talking about some of these things in the Q&A. Next, we have Steve Striffler, who's the president of the Faculty Staff Union at UMass Boston. And he has served on the executive committee of the union and is director of the Labor Resource Center. So you have about 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, Kelly, thanks. That was great. It's actually really nice to hear other experiences because I don't actually have a ton of experience. So I'll just put that out right away. I mean, in some ways, I think like our push for expanded bargaining came from similar sources. And I would just say like two broadly, and it came from a group in our union, I would just say, that are like on the left and internally just wanted to make the union more transparent and like engaging for its own members. And I think Sofya sort of mentioned this at the beginning. I really, like, for us in the past, bargaining was conveyed to members, and I think largely is this sort of esoteric kind of enterprise that was best left in the hands of a few skilled union members. And of course, the irony is, if you don't let other people know what's going on, it is sort of esoteric, and like that people just aren't, like, they don't have experience, and it is quite foreign, I think, to most members. So like there just needs to be like a level of getting them involved, education, you know, all of that, because it is kind of, it was behind closed doors, but it's also, I mean, I think like a total myth. I mean, Kelly, I think, gave a shout out to some of her staff members. I would say, like, for us, like you can transform your bargaining team fairly quickly if you have pretty good staff, like one or two that kind of really sort of can keep you on track. I feel like that's been really important for us as we've kind of made the transition. But, you know, faculty can figure this out and it can be done. And I would say to our union in the past, and we're trying to change this, you know, sort of define it as something that members really shouldn't be involved in, and more importantly, it wasn't something that was seen as an opportunity to organize members around. And that was what we were, I think, trying to change. So a lot of the motivation was a group within the union that wanted to make the union more transparent and get members more engaged. I mean, I think the second part was, of course, we felt that if you shined a light on bargaining and you brought more members to the table, that this could strengthen your position at the table, which I think is probably the more obvious one. I wouldn't say that was the primary motivation, like going in. I think we just wanted to democratize the union and get more people involved. And I suspect that's like true with a lot of unions. I mean, I think our process in some ways was like simple, but it was also a struggle. We had to first pass an expanded bargaining policy within our union because there was direct opposition from the union president at the time and a group of union, long-standing kind of union members. But we did this at our annual meeting. It was a fairly heated debate, but we just put a motion on and passed it. And I would say, ironically, because there wasn't like a lot of trust within the union, or there was some of this internal dissension, we passed a fairly rigid version, which as president now, I might want to walk back a bit. But it essentially said that all bargaining, not just main table bargaining, but anything that was bargained, it could be like a side agreement, a relatively small agreement, had to be done through expanded bargaining. And if the core bargaining team didn't want to do that, they had to bring it back to the members in a general meeting. And that's our policy. And we've actually done this at least once. I said, then the second hurdle, of course, was we had to get the administration to agree, just because we kept telling them, well, it's our policy now in our union, so you have to do it. But that didn't seem to persuade anybody. And so this was just a massive fight I guess this was the summer of 2020 during kind of the early months of the pandemic, right at the beginning of our main table bargaining over our 3-year contract. And I'll spare you the details, but many of the objections I think Kelly was sort of saying was that from admin was kind of that it would just lead, if you had members participating, it would just kind of lead to general chaos. And that if you didn't have the same members there every time, they would get these fancy ideas and they wouldn't have the context. And it was more, it was more about functioning and just creating chaos. And none of those, of course, were the real reasons they didn't want it. But those were the reasons that we were kind of given. We eventually landed on a version of expanded bargaining that allowed for 30 members beyond our core bargaining team. And we try to have our core bargaining team of about 8 to 10 members. So we have a fairly large team that is debating this all the time, but then you get sort of a 30 additional ones that could attend. And this was during virtual. So 30 members that would attend essentially as like silent observers in a webinar. So you see the presenters and then they're the observers. Most of the fight was about numbers. So we came in saying that all of our members are part of the bargaining team. They should all be allowed to participate. The administration said no, like there should be none. We eventually landed on 30. And I would say actually the biggest hurdle was that the administration wanted the 30 people to be the same 30 people at every bargaining session, which is virtually impossible because you can't schedule 10 people, let alone 30. But we haggled over this kind of for a long time. And then the one problem with our agreement, which I was just in a bargaining session today, fighting for it again, was that the agreement only existed for as long as university operations were located off campus. So this was like a COVID, more or less, agreement. Which meant that when operations are now back on campus, certainly teaching, but most of the other stuff is not. But the administration refused to continue with expanded bargaining. So today we brought 30 to 40 members to a virtual bargaining session, tried to get them in the session. They weren't allowed in. Our core team went back in. We sort of screamed at administration. They screamed at us. And they said, and the two main objections, I was talking about this before, but one was they did not like one of our members live tweeting during the bargaining sessions. Like this was just so offensive to their thin skin that they could have not imagined continuing. And the other one was like an email that I recently sent out that was frustrated. It wasn't a very calm email, but just about that it was ridiculous that we weren't starting bargaining until mid-October. Like we had been trying to get bargaining scheduled for all semester and that. So anyway, this was this was the reasons. Of course, they have nothing to do with expanded bargaining at all. We can send out emails and tweets all day long that they don't like, even if we're not doing expanded bargaining. But this was sort of what went. I think we won it again. I mean, I think it looks like they're not going to continue to push, and we're going to kind of return to I guess the status quo, which we're not entirely happy with either. We would like to have more than 30, et cetera, but we're okay with it. I'll just end maybe with a couple things. I mean, I think in terms of like the benefits for us, and this was the first time we've done it, so it's hard to say in some ways. I would say like on one level, we get more respect from administration when other people are watching. And this isn't really a big deal because it doesn't necessarily lead to anything, but you just feel a little bit better. And yet, as Kelly was saying, they can't help themselves. So like in both their tone and in their proposals, they're kind of awful. And for our members to see this, the kind of shit that they pull, it's very politicizing, both in terms of like, yeah, the tone and the dismissiveness towards us, but also in terms of the fact that often they're not very competent and they don't come prepared and they don't come ready. They waste our time. They refuse to do anything good for faculty without extracting like a pound of flesh. Like there's never a proposal that just makes it better for our lives. It's always like, if you want this, you have to give us this. And I also think, which I realize this is maybe, and it's all about power on some level, but they also don't like, I don't think they like other faculty to see how the core bargaining team talks to them, in the sense that in most contexts, they're totally in control. They control the narrative, they control the script. Like there's not really questions and answers. They're not forced to think on their feet. They don't have anyone pushing them. And that's the opposite of this. Like that, and that when 30 members or so see kind of them being challenged, that is like a threat, I think, as well to their power. And then finally, like some challenges we face, and I think what Kelly was saying, like Kelly just said, I think it's both smart and obvious, is that it doesn't mean anything if you don't get members to show up. And we've always been right around 30, but to get many more than that, I think would be a struggle. And when we go back in person, if we ever do go back in person for bargaining, it'll probably be more of a struggle. The virtual is good that way. And it requires, like, we also have a support team for the bargaining team, and coordinating that and making, and they're supposed to mobilize members. It's like a lot of work, like to continually communicate, continually mobilize. I mean, I think it's worth it, but it's a learning process, and we're sort of trying to kind of figure it out. It's a lot to manage. I would also say, like, in some places it's cumbersome. We've had, I would say, just 2 instances, and I'll finish here. On health and safety, we like to bargain with there's just a couple of issues that we like to bargain with the other unions on campus, the staff unions. Health and safety is one. Parking happens to be a big one on our campus. Obvious things that we have basically the same interest as staff. If they don't have this as a policy, it's a little tricky. Like, you can't force it on the staff to do expanded bargaining, so we run across that. And then there are some things, like sometimes you want to do really quickly. And I would say the vaccine mandate was one that, for a variety of reasons, we wanted to move that forward fairly quickly. We had total over 90% support for a mandate, we took it back to the union, and we kind of we didn't do that through expanded bargaining. But in terms of main table, it's been working quite good. Anyway, I'll stop rambling.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. It's really interesting to hear your version of the story. And then I was also in the earlier session hearing about Jason talking about some of the same issues. And it's really inspiring, as people are already starting to say in the chat. So we do have a nice amount of time now for questions, about 25 minutes. And so I would ask that if you have a comment or a question, that you type STACK in the chat like that, just so I can sort of keep order of the speakers. And currently, I think STACK is pretty open, but I do see Carol's hand. Okay, Carol, go ahead.
Thanks. We have similar problems, I would say, more to Steve than to Kelly, because Kelly's is new and we have a bureaucracy that's been around for over 20 years. So they're very entrenched. And I mean, we have people who go to the bargaining with the, who aren't, they're visitors basically, but they're not allowed to participate. But the real thing is that they're not allowed to bring back any information to the membership. So even if there are 10, 20, I don't know how many people are actually allowed in outside of the bargaining unit, it doesn't really matter because everything is hush hush and top secret, so that everything is left in their hands and we don't know what happens until the end of the day when they finally have a contract. And so the bureaucracy is so entrenched in our union and all of the unions, especially in New York, that I thought the idea of expanding, putting a resolution on the floor of expanding the number of people who are bargaining, but it's not just about how many people get to be in the room. It's about getting the information outside the room. And everybody who's in there has to agree to be silent. And so this is our problem, that we basically have no information for years on end, because that's literally how long the thing takes. And people are sworn to secrecy. So in order to have bargaining power, we have to be able to open up the bargaining and to the membership, and that we have to demand that they come back to us with what's going on, and that we have membership meetings, and we don't have any of those things. So I'm wondering, with whatever experience that either you or Steve have, that you could see we're sort of unique. We're different than you and Steve. And I mean, the bureaucracy is so entrenched that we have to be able to force their hand. We had one meeting many years ago at a place called Cooper Union, where there were a lot of people who were at the discussion about bargaining, and people wanted to strike. And so as soon as that came up, it became like, definitely we can't tell anybody about anything that's happening. So we have to figure out ways to knock down these walls, that, to open up it so that the membership doesn't participate, doesn't think it needs to participate, because basically it's kept out in the cold for the most part and has no expectations that it's going to be allowed in. So those dynamics have to change if we're going to change, and get a better contract, besides other things.
Carol, yeah, do you guys want to respond to her first, and then I'll go to Peter?
Sure. I would just say, first off, the thing that immediately made me think of, Carol, is how we have in our ground rules some sort of like code of conduct stuff, like people in the audience won't talk, and it can be really convenient when someone loudly gets a phone call and is like, oh, I can't, I'm in the middle of this stupid bargaining and I have to go, listen to it, and they run out the room or whatever. So I guess our position has always been like, if administrators want to try and silence faculty, if people are making it hard for us to get work done at the table, we'll say something. But like, if everyone's grumbling loudly in the audience and the admin lead negotiator wants to say something, she's welcome to. I'm not going to be policing faculty, right? Like, that's not what I'm here for. So I guess the rules are only as good as both parties adhere to them. So if you have a bargaining team who is willing to have people in the room, right? And I don't know, it seems like there's a lot of places you could start pushing on. I really have appreciated hearing from Steve and Jason today about this idea of extended bargaining. It's like not wide open, but it's a step towards open, right? It's way more open on this in the spectrum goes than what you've got. So yeah, maybe I'll pass to Steve.
Yeah, no, it's fun. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, our union's not that big. And so, I mean, I feel like for us, or at least the folks that were pushing this, I think we recognized that we needed to take over the union. And and that would include the executive committee, and that would include the bargaining team, and then eventually that would include like the president and the vice president. And that needed to sort of be done, I think, in part because, and this, not to like denigrate folks that came before so much, but that there was a real sense that in a way that, again, that bargaining was esoteric, that members didn't really know what they wanted or didn't understand it, and that gains could be won at the bargaining table through clever people. And I think when budgets are good and the economy is relatively good, there is a certain amount of truth to that incrementalism, that is that you just can expect to get your raises and some gains kind of every year. But we're like in a different moment now. And if you don't have power at the table in the form of members, it's really difficult to make any gains. And I think that was the thrust of it. And I think you have to have people on the bargaining team that are fully committed to that vision. And then you have to have a leadership that's fully committed to that vision too. And that's easy. And it's probably much easier to make that transformation, I think, relatively quickly in a small union where it doesn't take quite as much to take it over. And that's slightly a different situation, I think. I don't know if that sort of speaks to it a little bit. Oh, I would also say we don't agree to any ground rules. So the only ground rule we negotiated was expanded bargaining. Beyond that, and I'm not saying like this is our position and Kelly's, I think ground rules were perfectly fine. We think ground rules are for the administration, like that generally they only restrict us. And so we're just like, let's go right into bargaining. We'll bring our team, we're ready to go. And that's kind of how we, so there's no silencing, there's no like behavioral, like, sort of, I mean, on a webinar, it's sort of easier. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. I noticed that with the code of conduct that Kelly shared, that your union, that you're not allowed to live tweet, right? Or there's kind of a social media policy along with that.
Which honestly, we've live tweeted bargaining. So I think that I'm totally with you, Steve, that ground rules serve to limit things. For us, they were just like the starting place.
Yeah.
It's the trend for higher ed unions in Oregon. Everybody is having to do them now.
Makes sense. Okay, Peter, been waiting a minute.
Yeah, well, I'm hearing two different things here. There's open bargaining and expanded bargaining. They seem different from each other. And my situation is I'm not in a small union. It's quite a large union, and I'm an adjunct. And adjuncts historically feel left out from the very beginning of the bargaining, right? So I think in order for any kind of open or expanded bargaining to happen, in my situation, the adjuncts have to be brought in very early, and their demands, I guess, have to be heard and listed as important. But then once the situation gets going, I find it very difficult to believe that there'll be much openness. For example, recently there was a resolution passed by the delegates. It turned out to be very controversial, and the listservs were so bombed with people arguing, for or against. It became impossible to read them. I mean, the cacophony of feedback eliminated each other. In other words, at some point, there was no discussion because it was too noisy. The room was too noisy through emails. You see where I'm going with this? The openness can happen at the beginning. I can fully understand that. But to keep it open throughout the process seems quite impossible if we're trying to hear everyone's voice. And there's a lot of voices in the room.
Can I ask, how is your bargaining team formed? Like, are there adjuncts on the bargaining team?
I have no idea. And I'm a delegate. I'm on the EC of the chapter. I have no idea how the bargaining team is formed.
Angela, do you have a point of information? You look like you were going like this.
Yeah, I believe there was one last round.
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say is partly like the composition of the bargaining team is obviously really important in terms of recognizing whether it's job types or work locations. We have a lot of research stations around the state where their working conditions are very different from those of us on a campus. We have extension offices that have faculty who are out in farmers' fields, you know, doing lectures and different things. So we haven't had an extension faculty on our bargaining team, but that's like a known place where there are issues that we need to make sure we're getting input on specifically, right? 9-month faculty for 12-month faculty, like myself, there's always weird things about how leave is different, all kinds of things. So I think there's times to do that, like you said at the start. The listserv thing also sounds like fitting the right container for getting feedback, right? So we send out bargaining updates after basically every session. We get a lot of emails direct back from that where people are saying, okay, how does this actually apply? How would this apply to me in my particular circumstances? But we can also hold, you know, sessions where faculty can get together and talk about things out loud, which sometimes is easier than, you know, reading a billion emails that come through, right? So I think one of the responsibilities of the bargaining team is to make sure that you're getting that starting point. It is a long process, like Carol mentioned, it can take years. So you want to be sure you're starting from a place where you're getting feedback and input that is forming your platform, and then making sure that you're continuing to have places for people to speak up and be heard throughout, right? So it's not a one and done by any.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe just quickly add to that, and in terms of our bargaining team, we're about half what we call non-tenure track and about half tenure track faculty that are on there. And I would say, like in our union, historically, the I don't know, the orienting force or the most powerful force in the union was non-tenure track faculty. And there's some variation on that at times. I mean, I think the other thing for us, like for expanded, like I guess what that means for us is additional members come, right? They're allowed to observe it, but they come and they caucus with the core bargaining team before we bargain, then we caucus periodically during it. But in terms, it's not like chaotic in the sense that most of the nitty gritty, after we do surveys, after we get responses from faculty, like what's important to them, a lot of the nitty gritty in terms of the language, in terms of what we're pushing, is still very much in the hands of a core bargaining team that is engaged in this kind of constantly. And we try to engage with members as much as we can. But yeah, no, I mean, it's imperfect, like in terms of like the communication and the avenues for, you know, debate and those sorts of things. But that's kind of how we're handling it, at least at the moment.
Thank you. I think that was helpful clarification. So I think we have Sofya on stack.
Yeah, thank you both. So interesting. When we were in the working group, when we were planning this event, one question that came up over and over was, what if people don't come? It sounds like that's not a problem you're having, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about just like how it's framed within the union participation in open bargaining, and like, what do you say to people who are like, but you know, the contract is very long and complicated, like, what do I have to contribute? Like, why would I go versus, you know, people who, you know, have been working on it for a while and really understand how it all works. How do you deal with that type of argument from members?
I'll say that the sexy subjects help, right? So bargaining updates, we always say, hey, at the next session, we expect to talk about salary. That's exciting, right? And people have the topics they care most about that they'd like to attend for. I've also just found it's like a low effort event you know, for someone who is starting to get involved in their union, right? So the times, I mean, we've had attendance wax and wane. We have been doing some pretty grueling like COVID related impact bargaining where we're not making a lot of wins. It's been pretty bleak. We haven't had high attendance for that. I think people are pretty checked out and worn out with pandemic stuff. Salary reopener, we had much better attendance because people were more plugged into that, you know. So I think that to some extent, interest will just drive that. But it's been an easy thing for me to say, hey, can you show up at bargaining tomorrow? It would really mean a lot to me, you know, in my role. To have more faces in the audience. And by Zoom, the nice thing is you can even show up, and if you can't listen right now, it's your presence is still felt. So I think you can kind of drop in and see when there's something controversial. It's just like the drama of it can be really fun for people. There's a lot of sessions that are pretty like nitty gritty language that may or may not be as interesting, but I do think it's like any organizing opportunity where you got to get people to turn out and then follow up with them afterwards, right? A lot of times that's easy when there has been something, you know, that's really frustrating that happened in that session, to say, can you bring in somebody else next time? Because it really matters that we have people in the room when these things are happening.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I would say, like, we haven't struggled with numbers in terms of like, right, we have a target number of 30. So that kind of help, like, that's how we gauge, I guess, like success, if we kind of fill those 30. And we do a little bit of what kind of Kelly was referring to, like if there are particular issues, like we try to target particular groups that, you know, those issues kind of maybe are most, most important to. I would say, like, what we do struggle with though, and this is why we're always trying to develop this bargaining support team or sort of an organizing committee for it, is expanding beyond the usual suspects. And I really mean by that, expanding beyond the usual suspects within, in our case, the College of Liberal Arts, like getting more people in the sciences, in pretty much every other college. And that's not a knock on those colleges, but that's just something we struggle with. And it just takes a lot of reaching out but when they come, like, I think they do have like, yeah, they've never seen it before. They don't have a reference for it, but then also it's inevitably kind of politicizing in terms of just the relationship with admin. Yeah.
Yeah, I think earlier today we talked a lot about sort of the cross-title solidarity as well, with librarians and other kinds of staff members that this kind of policy can help foster. And I think that really helps with building trust in the union. And I really like how sort of Kelly was talking about this as a recruitment effort, because there are a lot of people who aren't joining the union. We're seeing more and more these days, and we see that at the PSC. So I think we've got Claudia next on stack.
You talked about, first of all, thank you. You talked about kind of doing a wrap-up session just with the bargaining team when you're done. Do you do any kind of prep with the people who are coming in order to prepare them for either the topics you're going to cover that day, or just what to expect and those kinds of things? Or do you just let them come and let things just go?
It's been fun for me to hear about the process that Steve's team uses, because it's like, oh, that's a brilliant idea. We never maybe have our act together enough to do that before a bargaining session, but we totally should. Usually people know from whatever led them to sign up for that session, whether that's an email or a conversation with somebody, sort of like what we expect roughly to happen. When we were doing this in person, you know, we often had coffee for people out, and so there was a chance for sort of that social part to happen beforehand. So we haven't, but I think it's an interesting, you know, there's a lot of sense in that in terms of both making sure that people know what's going on, but for the bargaining team being that much more sort of prepared to talk at the table, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure how we landed on our formula, but and it extends it. So like, you know, if today our bargaining was from 3 to 4:30 or 3:30 to 5. So we met with the expanded team at 3 to prep them. And in this case, it was really like, how are we going to handle the administration's attempt to roll back expanded bargaining? And that was why they were there. So we had a lot. And at that point, once they threw out the agreement, the number 30 no longer mattered. So we just wanted to get as many people as we could. And then our plan, actually, I think the core bargaining team, the idea was, well, we'll just go in, just the core team, talk to them about expanded bargaining, see what happens. And the people on the expanded people, the extra 30, 40, in this case, I think we're around 40, said, no, we want to try and get in the meeting right from the beginning. And so we were like, okay, let's go for that. But that's like the normal thing in this. And it works for us too, because I think we're pretty well organized, but it's always nice too, like if we've talked about something, say a week before the core bargaining team, to just prep 30 minutes before the actual bargaining with this expanded group and have to articulate like, okay, here's what we're going to do. This is what's happening today. Here's what you can expect, and get their input. Like we do get their input, and at times we change, and then expect when you're watching it, but then when we say we're going back in, hey, we need to caucus, then we go back into the caucus, we talk to the whole team, and then we do sort of like a debrief for about, it just depends. Like we have a person that kind of runs it, and we're always saying, all right, when are you going to, like, you know, at some point it's just, you know, it devolves into whatever, but you just have to wrap it up. But yeah, so it extends it quite a bit, right? So if your bargaining is an hour and a half or 2 hours, it's an extra half hour on each end for us. But it feels like essential, because otherwise, even with an email, I just feel like they just kind of need to hear it and also hear, I think also just hear our logic and our thinking about like why we might be giving up something that they really like, and let them have a moment of like, no, or, you know, or, you know, to kind of wrestle with it. And it gives us like also just like a pulse of where, in this case, I would say like where our most active members are. I wouldn't say like it doesn't give us a pulse of like all members. Like, I mean, and an aside, like someone said in the meeting, like, we can't fight for expanded bargaining this time. Like we're rehabbing this fight. We might not want to fight for this for 3 bargaining sessions when people are kind of waiting on their raises. You know, like it can't go on forever. So it's useful to hear that as well. But that's kind of how we do it.
I think Rose is on stack.
Yeah, thank you. This is terrific. I'm so glad this has been organized. And Kelly, I specifically was intrigued because you know, you're able to tell us sort of from the beginning, you know, there was the beginning of the fall 2018, you know, like you can think back that far and what happened. I just, you know, I'm curious how you start with nothing. I mean, there's something, but you know, the formal something begins. And how did you develop the bargaining team? How did you put people on that versus people like me who are, you know, I'm active in my union, but I'm not on any kind of a bargaining team. I saw a need during the pandemic to have a phone calling group. So, and to just mention something about cross-title solidarity, that has been so great, because on our phone calling group, we had, you know, 3 faculty, we had, was it 1 or 2 adjunct? I forget, Claudia, and then staff. So, and we worked great together on this phone calling committee. So that was, I didn't even think about that as being a cross-title thing until really recently I started hearing that as a topic of discussion in our union. But more to the question for you about, you know, that beginning point and putting people on the bargaining team and having disparate views, even though they may have all been very pro open bargaining, let's say, you know, or some of the concepts were all shared, but you've got different people. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, I'll say that all these discussions have been really helpful for me in terms of thinking about process, because part of being new is you don't have policies and procedures in place. So we want to not build a union that's going to end up so calcified that people are like, oh, we can never change how bargaining happens, right? So we want to make sure like we're reflecting what members want. Our initial bargaining team was almost entirely people who'd been involved in the organizing committee that was involved in certification, that before we existed as a union. So almost all longtime activists. There was a real push to make sure we had different, I guess, our titles in your system, job classifications, and ours classifications and categories. So tenure line faculty, instructional fixed term instructional faculty, and fixed term research faculty are sort of the big buckets for us. People in different disciplines. So we're a largely science and engineering university. It was really important to have our applied math guys and, be able to speaking to what Steve mentioned about not drawing too heavily on the College of Liberal Arts, right? Where it's sort of being able to speak to the heavy research part. So we had people who had been PIs and supervisors, had been out of our unit and now are back in. So those are some of the considerations. I'll be honest, also, it was like, who's a little naive and a warm body who can be on the team. So, doing an inaugural contract is, there's no way to know what you're getting into. So I think, those were all kind of factors. We had a small group of activists to work with. So I think that's also a factor there. I'll say for the impact bargaining we've done, it has been helpful to have that initial team to draw on as far as people who have had some familiarity with bargaining, but we always want to bring in new people. So whether that's in, we had someone from public health who joined us in terms of thinking about COVID-19, which was really useful to have that subject expertise in that case. I'll say having faculty, for me, the disciplinary stuff sometimes gets highlighted because talking about salary, it was really helpful for us to have an applied mathematician and someone, a gender studies scholar, right? Because those are lenses that are really useful as we're approaching that topic. So those are some of the things. I'll say we don't actually have a very clear process in our constitution and bylaws for how the bargaining team is constituted. It just has to be approved by our executive committee. So I think this is all giving me thoughts that maybe we need a more direct democracy sort of channel for that. But this is the first school year we've had elected officials all school year. So we're like inch by inch building our processes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very aware of time, and I'm very aware that Steve was in bargaining sessions today, and Kelly was in our earlier session as well. So I think I think we're gonna have one more question and then sort of close out and hopefully keep these ideas kind of in circulation and think about how we can implement them at PSC. So I see Ruth is on stack.
Well, I had meetings that meant I came late to the noon one and I came late to this one. So, but I would speak to how we could implement this at PSC. If you don't mind a naive person coming in late, any thoughts on how to actually get management? We'll work on the union part, but how to get management to accept more people in the bargaining sessions.
Yeah, it's a good basic question here. Anyone want to quickly take it before we're seeing in the chat? Just tell them what we want.
The phrase that comes to my mind is direct action gets the goods. And it does seem like the kind of case where if you had a whole bunch of faculty outside the door, are they really going to tell all those people to go away? I mean, for our ground rules, the like back and forth on that, we started just letting people in, and that kind of solved that, right? So the context matters, but it does seem like if you're waiting for admin to just okay it, that's not that's obviously not going to happen, right? So building that power within your union is where that's going to come from.
Yeah, no, I mean, we had many meetings with them, just haggling out all of their anxieties and concerns and fears. But I will say, ultimately, it was in the case of like a webinar, just having, you know, every time having 40 people that were not on the core bargaining team trying to get into the meeting and them rejecting them and, you know, not letting them in. I mean, that was ultimately it. And I think also like it's like, you know, just you ask them like, so what are we supposed to tell our members? Is it just that you don't want bargaining to be transparent and open? Because that seems to be like the only argument for it. And there isn't like a great, they don't have a great response to that. I mean, and that is, yeah, that's all it is. It's not like that. All their arguments are just so weak and so thin that at some point, I think they realize that too. And in our case got, you know, worn down by it a little bit. And again, we didn't win like a total victory. We get 30 extra people, but it's, I think for us, it's like, it was significant. And, you know, I think you just have to not, we gave in some, right? We started with, we want 1,000 members to be able to attend. And then we came down, but I mean, I think we weren't willing to like give up, you know, give up everything, so.
All right, thank you so much to Steve and Kelly, and also to everyone who made it, who made time for this call. And I really hope that we can sort of put these principles into action. I don't know, Sofya, do you have any other closing remarks? I'm not sure we have follow-up stuff.
Yeah, just really grateful to our guests and to everyone who attended. We're going to send a follow-up email with the recordings. Please share them, right? I think I'm sensing that a lot of folks are interested in building towards open bargaining for us in the PSC. And I think, as Jason said in our noon session, like it requires a lot of like just education about what it is and what it looks like and how it works. So this is, you know, this is how we started these 2 sessions, right? And so we want to hear what the next steps are and what your ideas are for how we spread the word and how we build within the PSC towards this, towards open bargaining and just towards democratizing the bargaining process in the union itself. So that's all I have. Thanks to everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Angela, I'm going to save the chat. I'm not sure it's automatic, so I'm going to do that. Thank you for all your support in the background. That was awesome.
Sure, glad I could jump in and do it.
All right.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.